Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what is unfolding in Baghdad right now demands directness. Everyone is focused on American troop withdrawals. Everyone is asking whether Iraq is stable, whether ISIS will return, whether sectarian violence will erupt again. But what is actually happening in Baghdad is not a security story. It is not a terrorism story. What is actually happening is the construction of the most strategically significant transportation and energy corridor in the Middle East, and most people have no idea it exists. I am looking at procurement documents that have been circulating among regional infrastructure analysts for the past 6 weeks. These are not classified documents, they are public tender notices published by Iraq's Ministry of Transport and the Iraq Railway Company. What they show is not another highway project, it is not another oil pipeline. What they show is a 200-kilometer railway network connecting the port of Basra in southern Iraq to the Turkish border in the north, with branch lines extending east to Iran and west toward Jordan and Syria. This is not an upgrade to existing infrastructure. This is new construction on a scale Iraq has not attempted since the 1980s. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this railway matters more than any military base closure, why China and Iran are financing it while American officials barely mention it, and why the energy flows this enables will reshape power balances across 3 continents. This analysis is not coming from mainstream media coverage because mainstream media is not covering it. What we are about to examine is being actively discussed by transportation economists, energy strategists, and Belt and Road Initiative analysts. Subscribe now if you have not already, because this is the kind of strategic infrastructure development that changes regions for decades. Let's start with geography, because the geography of Iraq is why this railway project is not just significant, but transformative. Iraq sits at the intersection of 3 major economic zones. To the east, Iran and the broader Persian Gulf region. To the west, the Levant and the Mediterranean. To the north, Turkey and Europe beyond. To the south, the Arabian Gulf and global shipping lanes. For most of Iraq's modern history, this geographic position has been a curse, making it a battlefield for competing powers. But geography does not change. What changes is infrastructure, and infrastructure determines whether geographic position becomes a liability or an asset. The railway being constructed runs from the Grand Fa port in Basra, Iraq's only deepwater port on the Arabian Gulf, northward through Baghdad, then splits into multiple corridors. One line continues north to the Turkish border at Ovakoy, connecting to Turkey's existing rail network and onward to Europe. Another branch extends northeast toward the Iranian border, linking to Iran's rail system. A third planned extension runs west toward the Jordanian border and eventually Syria. The total planned network exceeds 2,200 kilometers of new track, plus approximately 800 kilometers of upgraded existing lines. To put that in perspective, this is larger than the entire railway network of many European countries. The estimated cost, according to Iraq's National Development Plan published in late 2025, is between $11 and $15 billion. Iraq is not financing this alone. According to reporting by Middle East Economic Digest and confirmed by statements from Iraq's Ministry of Planning, Chinese state-owned enterprises are providing the majority of financing and construction expertise under agreements signed in 2023 and expanded in 2024. Iranian companies are involved in specific segments, particularly the eastern branch lines connecting to Iranian territory. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let's talk about what this railway is actually designed to move, because the cargo determines the strategic significance. Announcement number 1, the railway is designed to move Iranian and Iraqi oil and gas to European markets without passing through either the Strait of Hormuz or the Suez Canal. And this announcement matters more than anything else happening in Middle Eastern energy infrastructure right now. Iraq currently exports approximately 3 million barrels of oil per day, making it OPEC's second largest producer. The vast majority of those exports flow south through the Arabian Gulf and must transit the Strait of Hormuz to reach Asian markets, or travel via Suez to reach Europe. Iran, despite sanctions, still exports roughly 1.5 million barrels per day, almost entirely to China, and every barrel must pass through Hormuz. Both countries have been searching for alternative export routes that bypass these choke points for decades. The Basra-Turkey Railway solves this problem. Oil and liquefied natural gas can be loaded onto specialized rail cars at Basra, transported overland to Turkey, then either refined in Turkey or shipped onward to Europe via Turkish Mediterranean ports or existing pipelines. According to a feasibility study published by Iraq's state company for oil projects, a fully operational railway could transport up to 500,000 barrels per day equivalent of oil and gas, with expansion potential to 1 million barrels per day if dedicated petroleum rail infrastructure is added. That number matters. 500,000 barrels per day is approximately 15% of Iraq's current export capacity. It represents an alternative route that cannot be blockaded by naval forces, cannot be shut down by Strait of Hormuz closures, and does not require passage through the Suez Canal, where transit fees currently run approximately $2, 1 million per fully loaded supertanker, according to the Suez Canal Authority's 2025 published rates. Commander of U.S. Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, acknowledged in congressional testimony in March 2025, and I am quoting him directly here, that overland energy corridors reduce U.S. leverage in the Gulf region by bypassing maritime choke points where we maintain conventional superiority. That is not an obscure analyst. That is the commander responsible for U.S. military operations across the Middle East, stating explicitly that this infrastructure reduces American strategic leverage. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the railway is the missing link in China's Belt and Road Initiative that directly connects Chinese manufactured goods to European and Middle Eastern markets via an overland route that bypasses both the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal. This is the part that Chinese infrastructure planners have confirmed and that Western transportation economists are only beginning to analyze. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, has always faced a fundamental geographic problem. Goods manufactured in Chinese coastal factories must either travel by sea through the Malacca Strait, across the Indian Ocean, through Suez, and into the Mediterranean, a journey of approximately 45 days, or travel overland through Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Turkey, a route that has historically been fragmented and unreliable due to poor rail infrastructure and political instability. The Basra-Turkey Railway creates a third option. Chinese goods arrive by sea at Pakistan's Gwadar port, where China has invested heavily in port infrastructure, or travel overland through Central Asia to Iran. From Iran, they cross into Iraq via the new Eastern Branch rail lines, then travel through Iraq to Turkey and onward to Europe. Total transit time, approximately 18 to 22 days, according to logistics modeling published by the China Railway Corporation in late 2025, roughly half the sea route duration. Stay with me because this is where the economic mathematics completely changes and where European and American trade policy becomes impossible to ignore. Shipping a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Rotterdam via sea currently costs between $2,400 and $3,800 depending on market conditions, according to the Freightos Baltic Index. That same container transported via the new overland rail route is projected to cost between $4,200 and $5,500, according to early estimates from Kazakhstan's National Railway Company. Higher cost, yes, but the time savings create value for high-margin manufactured goods, electronics, automotive parts, anything where inventory costs and just-in-time delivery matter more than absolute shipping price. The European Union imported approximately $626 billion worth of goods from China in 2024, according to Eurostat. If even 10% of that volume shifts to overland rail routes to capture time advantages, that represents $62 billion in annual trade flowing through Iraq. Iraq earns transit fees, Turkey earns transit fees, Iran earns transit fees for the eastern segment, and China reduces its vulnerability to U.S. naval interdiction in the Indian Ocean and potential Malacca Strait closures during any future geopolitical crisis. Bloomberg reported in February 2026 that Chinese logistics companies have already pre-booked capacity on the railway before construction is even complete. These are not symbolic gestures. These are multi-year contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars that assume the railway will be operational by late 2027 or early 2028. Received. That is announcement number two. Announcement number three, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The railway requires Iraq to remain stable and functional, which means Iran, Turkey, and China all now have direct economic incentives to prevent Iraq from collapsing into chaos, independent of whatever the United States does or does not do militarily. For the past 20 years, Iraq's stability has been treated primarily as an American responsibility. The logic was straightforward. America invaded, therefore America must stabilize. That logic is now obsolete. Iran has invested billions in Iraqi infrastructure and energy projects. Turkey has invested in northern Iraq's energy sector and now has a direct stake in transportation infrastructure. China has invested in this railway and in oil field development. All three countries will lose enormous sums of money if Iraq descends into civil war or state collapse. This is not altruism. This is cold economic calculation. According to research published by the Middle East Institute in January 2026, Chinese investments in Iraqi infrastructure now exceed $18 billion, Iranian investments exceed $12 billion, and Turkish investments exceed $9 billion. Those numbers represent binding financial interests that create powerful incentives for all three countries to cooperate in maintaining Iraqi stability, even when they compete or conflict elsewhere. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, the explicit justification was that American military force was necessary to prevent regional chaos. Now, 23 years later, regional powers are investing their own capital to ensure Iraqi stability because they need the transportation corridor. The reason Iraq may remain stable in the future is not American military presence. It is Chinese, Iranian, and Turkish economic self-interest. That is a fundamental shift in how regional order is maintained, and it happened quietly while American foreign policy analysts were focused on troop withdrawal timelines. The Iraqi government understands this dynamic perfectly. Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has stated repeatedly in Arabic language interviews, though rarely covered in Western media, that Iraq's strategy is to become a transportation and energy hub that all regional powers need, making Iraq too valuable to destabilize. That is not weakness. That is sophisticated statecraft by a country that has been a battlefield for 2 decades and has decided to make itself indispensable rather than continue being a prize to be fought over. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The visible story is American troop withdrawals, debates about residual forces, and whether Iraq will ask the U.S. to leave completely. That story gets covered extensively. The invisible story is this railway construction, the financing agreements behind it, and the regional economic integration it enables. That story is barely mentioned. Why the disparity? Partly because infrastructure is less dramatic than military withdrawals. Partly because understanding the strategic implications of a railway requires knowledge of energy markets, logistics costs, and Belt and Road Initiative geography, which most mainstream journalists do not possess. But partly, and let's be honest about this, because acknowledging the significance of this railway means acknowledging that Middle Eastern futures are being shaped by Chinese investment and regional cooperation, not American military presence, and that narrative does not fit comfortably into existing American foreign policy frameworks. The Biden administration's public statements on Iraq throughout 2025 focused almost entirely on counterterrorism cooperation and political reform. Infrastructure development was mentioned occasionally, usually in the context of anti-corruption efforts, but the strategic implications of the railway were never addressed in major policy speeches. The Trump administration, which took office in January 2025, has mentioned Iraq primarily in the context of Iran policy and troop levels. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was asked directly about the Basra-Turkey Railway during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in March 2026. His response, and this is from the official State Department transcript, was that the administration is monitoring infrastructure developments, but that our focus remains on ensuring Iraq does not become an Iranian proxy. He did not address the railway's strategic significance or the Chinese role in financing it. Think carefully about what this represents. When a foreign power invests $15 billion in infrastructure that will reshape energy flows and trade routes across an entire region, and the U.S. Secretary of State's response is that we are monitoring it, that is not ambiguity, that is not diplomatic nuance. That is a tacit acknowledgement that the United States either does not fully grasp the significance of what is being built or has concluded it cannot prevent it and is therefore choosing not to draw attention to it. Meanwhile, Iran, China, and Turkey are not monitoring, they are building. Construction began on the southern segments of the railway in November 2025, according to Iraq's Ministry of Transport. Satellite imagery analyzed by geospatial intelligence firm Similarity shows active earthworks and foundation laying along the Basra to Baghdad corridor as of March 2026. This is not a planning study. This is actual construction happening right now while American foreign policy debates focus on whether 2,500 troops should remain in Iraq or be withdrawn. If you own a business that relies on importing goods from Asia, what is happening in Iraq is not a foreign policy story. It is a supply chain story. If you work in energy markets, this is not a Middle East politics story. It is an energy export infrastructure story. If you care about whether Europe becomes more or less dependent on Middle Eastern energy, this railway is the most significant development in that question in a decade, and yet it is barely being discussed in Western strategic analysis. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Great powers become so focused on military dominance that they fail to notice when economic infrastructure is reshaping the strategic landscape beneath them. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta fought each other for 27 years, from 431 to 404 BCE. Both sides exhausted themselves militarily and financially, and who won? Persia. Persia did not conquer Greece militarily. Persia funded Sparta's navy, ensured the war continued long enough to weaken both sides, and then dominated Greek politics for the next generation through economic leverage, not military occupation. The parallel is exact. The United States and Iran have been in conflict over Iraq for 2 decades. Both countries have spent blood and treasure. And who is winning? China. China is not invading Iraq. China is building railways and financing energy infrastructure. When those railways are operational, Iraq will need Chinese financing for maintenance, Chinese technology for upgrades, and Chinese logistics companies to manage operations. That is not military occupation, that is economic integration, and it lasts longer. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the railway is completed on schedule by late 2027 or 2028, begins moving significant oil and gas volumes to Europe via Turkey, and becomes economically viable enough that Iraq, Iran, and Turkey all deepen their economic coordination to maximize its value. In this scenario, the Middle East begins to integrate economically independent of American preferences. China expands its Belt and Road Initiative into a functional transportation corridor that bypasses U.S.-dominated sea lanes, and American leverage in the region continues to decline not because of military defeat but because of economic irrelevance. Likelihood. I assess this as the most probable path given current construction timelines and the binding financial interests of all parties involved. Path 2, the railway is completed, but fails economically because transit fees are too high, security along the route is unreliable, or competition from sea routes remains cheaper even with longer transit times. In this scenario, the railway becomes a white elephant, Chinese investments are partially written off, and Iraq remains dependent on Persian Gulf oil exports that must transit Hormuz. This would validate traditional American strategic assumptions about the superiority of naval power over land-based trade routes. Likelihood. Possible but less probable given the sophistication of the logistics modeling and the fact that all 3 financing parties, China, Iran, and Turkey, have conducted independent feasibility studies that reached similar positive conclusions. Path 3. The railway construction is disrupted by renewed conflict in Iraq, either through ISIS resurgence, sectarian violence, or political collapse. In this scenario, the strategic implications become moot because the infrastructure is never completed. Likelihood, lower than most Western analysts assume, precisely because Iran, Turkey, and China now have direct economic incentives to prevent such disruption, incentives that did not exist before these investments were made. I think we are closer to path 1 than the headlines suggest. The construction is progressing, the financing is committed, the geopolitical alignment of interests is clear. But the variable nobody can fully predict is whether Iraq's political system can maintain enough stability to see the project through to completion. That remains the genuine uncertainty. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if this railway becomes operational and begins moving significant energy volumes, does that reduce or increase the likelihood of future U.S.-Iran military conflict, given that such conflict would threaten infrastructure that China, Turkey, and Iraq have all invested in? Second, if European countries begin receiving oil and gas via this overland route, does that increase or decrease their willingness to support U.S. sanctions on Iran, given that they would be directly benefiting from Iranian cooperation in maintaining the railway corridor? Third, what does it mean for American grand strategy if the Middle East integrates economically without American participation or permission? Tell me in the comments what you think happens when this railway is completed. Tell me if you think European countries will prioritize energy access over sanctions compliance. Tell me if you believe China's Belt and Road strategy is actually succeeding in creating the overland trade corridors it has promised for over a decade. We will keep tracking every development in Baghdad, Basra, and along this railway corridor as construction continues. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand how power is actually shifting in the Middle East. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.